Okay, good. People are connecting. Welcome, everybody. Greetings from New Mexico. We're going to put the first slide with the rules. So you know, this session is being recorded. We upload it to different websites so people can watch it offline. We would like to invite you to type your name, your email, and affiliation in the chat so we can record. And if you're not talking, please mute yourself. There's a lot of those microphones pick up a lot of noise. After the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. But while the speaker is presenting, you can type in your questions in the chat so we can have a list of questions ready to be asked to the presenter. And if we ask you for you to ask the question, please state your name, affiliation, and then ask the question. If bandwidth allows, please turn on your camera. We want to see faces. And I know depending on the part of the world you connect, the bandwidth is limited, and that can have a serious effect on participating. So I think we're ready to get started. Next slide, please. This is the topic for today is on environmental and social assessments, the why, the when, and how. Engineers, we usually kind of drop that. This is something that we want engineers to be aware of and think about the intended and unintended consequences. We have global challenges that need to be addressed, and we need to be aware of especially unintended consequences. We have a great speaker today. Next slide, please, Donna. Dr. Elizabeth Losos she works at the Nicholas Institute of Environment and Policy Solutions at the university. She is become a close member of the Peace Engineering ECHO, and we are really thankful for having Liz here to present from the point of view of sustainability. And Liz, I'm going to pass the microphone to you. Please say a little bit about yourself, and then it's your talk. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I am really delighted to be here. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Well, I thank you for inviting me. I'm, as I said, delighted to be here. My background, I am a tropical forest ecologist, have worked all over the world in the tropics on issues related to forest ecology, conservation, sustainable development, especially in Latin America, but also throughout tropical Asia and Africa. And in the last 4 years, I also have a policy background as well as biology, and have started to work a lot on sustainable infrastructure. And my particular focus has been on China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and its implications for environmental and social impact of all the infrastructure that China is helping finance around the world. Although also more broadly looking at infrastructure financed by all governments. And I am going to use that to first tell you what I'm going to say today, and then I will talk a little bit more about sustainable infrastructure before I get into the environmental assessments. So in my presentation today, I will talk about sustainable infrastructure, in particular, the SI-CoL, or Community of Learners, which I want to introduce you all to. And then I will pivot specifically to the environmental and social benefits and risks of infrastructure, the role that assessments play, both impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments. I'm going to provide a few examples and then talk about where next, what that might do. I'm going to focus in particular at the end on the project that Peace Engineers have been especially focused on, the Fellbaum Health Center in Kenya. So with that introduction, let me just move my screen around a little here. So what is sustainable infrastructure? It is actually, thanks to the Inter-American Development Bank, been defined, and this is the definition that's becoming widely acceptable. It's infrastructure projects that are planned, designed, constructed, operated, and decommissioned in a manner that ensures economic and financial, social, environmental, including climate resilience, and institutional sustainability over the entire life cycle of the project. Getting the sustainable infrastructure community to agree on that definition literally took years. But I think the interesting thing about that is it really does resonate quite a bit with the values and the goals of the Peace Engineers. Even if you all haven't thought of it quite in this context, I think it's really addressing a lot of the same issues. And so a few years ago, as we were working on this, we realized that despite this growing interest in sustainable infrastructure and broad calls across the globe for building sustainable infrastructure, the adoption has been lagging. And there are lots of reasons, but one that we particularly focused on was that even though there are lots of tools and guidelines and standards, they're hard to find and access. It's very unclear from practitioners exactly what they should be using, what are the best practices. There aren't a lot of case studies. And overall, just the lack of capacity amongst the practitioners turned out to be a big impediment between the aims for sustainable infrastructure and the actual development. And so we, about a year ago, began to form a community of practice amongst sustainable infrastructure experts called the SI-CoL, or the Sustainable Infrastructure Community of Learners. And the mission is to share information, expertise, and resources globally to improve approaches, outcomes, and uptake of sustainable infrastructure capacity development in particular. And so I just wanted to, and here's just a list of many of the organizations that have signed on. They're across the globe. And in particular, we are closely aligned with the UN Environment Program. So I just wanted to set that as to where I'm coming from, and I will return to SI-CoL and opportunities at the end of the talk. So, sorry, again, I need to move my screen around so I can read my words. I think everyone here knows that infrastructure can provide some incredible benefits that humanity needs, and indeed that's the purpose of having Peace Engineers, for all the humanitarian benefits. But at the same time, there are also many serious environmental and social risks that infrastructure can cause, particularly if not well planned and executed. And I'm not going to go through the whole litany. I think a lot of these pictures speak for themselves, but this is really a tremendous concern, and particularly given the fact that infrastructure has a multi-decadal lifespan. If you build poor infrastructure, you're really stuck with it for a very long time. So making sure that what you build is what a community, a government, a business needs is incredibly important. And just to speak a little bit more, I think most people, when they think about these risks or these impacts from infrastructure, they're thinking a lot about the direct impacts, whether it's the pollution or toxins in the water or any range of impacts from poorly designed, poorly built infrastructure. But there are also what we call indirect impacts or cumulative impacts of which are a result of infrastructure, but not perhaps as easily noticed or even predicted. And often these impacts can be actually the most serious. This is a picture, this is called fishbone development from the Amazon. And what you see is this large line here is a road that went in, which was planned, and all these other spin-offs or fishbones are from spontaneous development that quickly spread, and a lot of the deforestation along the Amazon was from this this spiraling, uncontrolled fishbone development. And while settlements don't have to be bad, if they're not well planned and the services aren't available, it can often be really quite disastrous, as we've seen in much of the Amazon. One example, which I thought was, which I'll come back to later today, a current problem given the high price of gold these days, is that this spontaneous development has also led to a huge rash of gold mining, illegal, it's called artisanal, small-scale gold mining, although artisanal I find is a very odd sort of title. It is devastating to the forests, to the fish, to the biodiversity, but especially to the communities, both those that lived there before and those that have moved in. The mercury poisoning and other health impacts are devastating. And this is a problem all over the world, but there's certain areas where it's particularly worrisome. So this would be an indirect impact from, in this case, it was the interoceanic highway that was built to connect Peru to ports in Brazil, and it opened up a huge corridor for settlers to come in. So what's to be done about this? That doesn't mean that we can't build infrastructure. In fact, we need infrastructure. We have to build it, but what one hopes is that environmental assessments can help us do a better job of selecting and building, designing, et cetera. And I want to make a note here. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to say environmental assessments, but in recent years, this has been largely expanded to environmental and social assessments. They're really one and the same, because a lot of the impacts are both social and environmental. They hurt communities, whether through their health or other economic, hurting the environment, et cetera. So most people still use as freehand environmental assessments, but realize that I'm talking about the impact both on the environment and the communities where the infrastructure exists. So this is I think a nice schematic from one of the organizations that's in SI-CoL. It's the Netherlands Commission on Environmental Assessments. It's a government agency in Dutch agency, which does really wonderful work helping countries around the world with their environmental assessments. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but the critical, this is just a sort of generalized type of environmental assessment. And what you see is from the beginning, you ask, why do you want to do something? And you analyze what the problem is, what the opportunities, and you bring public participation in from the beginning. And if it turns out that this isn't something that is desired or needed, you can stop the project then, or you go to the next phase where it's, what can we do? And you, at that point, define objectives, describe a range of solutions, and then you specify priorities and look at bottlenecks, again, bringing in public participation. You move to the third step. Now you've got a range of solutions. Where can we do this. You look at which of these solutions are appropriate, what the local conditions are. Again, if these, through public participation, do not appear to provide the outcomes you want, you can stop the project at that point. And then finally, you get to the point of how do we address that, where you begin to prepare a project with designing a plan and going through. The critical point is that you're starting early and you're bringing in public participation throughout the way. So let's look at some specific types of environmental assessments. The one that probably everyone is at least heard of, if not familiar with, are environmental impact assessments. These became popular. It's amazing to realize it's been almost 50 years since these have become pretty much required, not of every project, but those whose scope determines that it's needed. And it's actually covered in an international agreement called the ESPO Treaty from 1990. Almost every country in the world requires EIAs for at least those projects that pose some sort of environmental or social risks. And while the procedures vary around the world, they're relatively standardized. I think there's a pretty good set of what is expected and needed. And the goal is to avoid environmental and social impacts that result in net harm to people and their environments, with the idea of anticipating what mitigation measures are needed, and ideally, or in some cases, if they're so severe that they can't be mitigated, the EIA would actually, in theory, stop the project. If you cannot mitigate the damages and the benefits do not outweigh the environmental and social costs. Environmental impact assessments are conducted prior to the final decision regarding the project. So they come in fairly late in the process, and the decision makers, depending on the type of project, where it is, et cetera, will be government agencies, contractors, outside parties, or in some case, property owners, depending on the situation. So I'm not going to do a deep dive into how you do an EIA, because we don't have that much time. I can talk about some of these issues later, but just a couple of the highlights are, as I mentioned, you start by screening whether a project even qualifies or requires, and these are done at the project level. And then scoping, if it does, you need to figure out what aspects of the project will be required for environmental assessment. You do the analysis, you figure out what the mitigation options are. In theory, you bring in public consultation. The result is an environmental impact statement, which lays all of this out. It's reviewed by authorities, ideally also through broad participation, and then a decision is made. The project can go forward, but these changes need to be made. It might be changes in procurement or siting or timing or any of many different possibilities. And then, of course, you're also ideally supposed to continue to follow up and monitor. Have these steps been taken? Are the expected outcomes actually coming to bear? For example, if you're trying to abate certain pollutants and you require actions to be taken, you'd also want to be monitoring what the level of that pollutant is. So I'm going to just give a couple of examples of environmental impacts and assessments and how they've come into play in a couple of examples. The first is in Guinea, bauxite mining. And just briefly, bauxite mining in the last few years, bauxite, which is used for aluminum production, has also risen greatly in price, and there's been a big demand for it in the global market. And so for the government, for industry, it was extremely attractive in Guinea for tax revenue, for job creation, for mining profits. And also the government was really eager, as there was this sort of burst in demand for Guinea to kind of grab that part of the market and be able to take a big share of it. So they moved forward with sort of all, with all speed. And as a consequence, there was insufficient, if any, sort of environmental and social assessment properly taken out, or any sort of actions to mitigate potential hazards from this huge increase in bauxite mining in Guinea. And the result was pretty dramatic, particularly for the local communities around the area where the area in Bokeh in Guinea. And this is a picture of a report that came out last year by the Human Rights Watch, which really does a good job of listing out what the impact has been. And I think this is pretty much sums it up. What do we get out of it? Which is, of course, the local communities. But specifically, they point out that there has been greatly diminished, reduced access by the community to water, and especially clean water. People have not been able to drink the water available locally. There's not sufficient water even for washing. The bauxite mining creates this dust that has literally covered crops and homes and kitchens, etc., which has had an enormous impact. It's created these big lakes, red lakes, with the tailings from the bauxite mining. There's now a lack of electricity in the area, even though there was a great increase in electricity for the mining. And there's been an expropriation. They've taken away lands without appropriate compensation to the people who were living around the area. And you may not be surprised to hear that this led to nationwide protests where people from these communities stormed the capitals, and then there was police response and a lot of ugly conflicts. This is just the type of example of environmental national security threats that will continue to threaten the world, particularly with increasing climate change and threats that we're not even, risks that we're not even anticipating at this point. And a careful analysis ahead of time might have been able to avoid this. So another example where environmental impact assessment was carried out, but there are also issues, and that was the standard gauge railway in Kenya. This is a very well-known and controversial line. There's lots of different pieces of it. I'm just going to talk about the section that went through Nairobi National Park. And for several years, there were fights because this rail line was going to go straight through this national park, which is just right outside of Nairobi, an important tourist destination, but also very iconic for the country, for the city of Nairobi. And it was seen as a, there were protests for years about the impact on the wildlife, on the tourism trade, etc. And environmental impact assessments were carried out and came up with a range of different mitigation actions that were able to help ensure that, or try to mitigate the barrier that this rail line would create to the wildlife. And so what you see is they ended up, instead of having the railway go on the ground, which is what it does in much of the rest of the line, but actually for a very large section, it's elevated. However, this enormously increased the costs of the rail line. It not only was expensive for the actual cost, but the delays in and of itself created more costs. It created very bad relations with the communities. There were protests literally for years. They seem to, there is a question of how big the economic impact on diminished tourism, but that has been a big concern. And then importantly, even with these changes, there was an inability to do some of the proposals that for mitigation that really would have had a lasting solution, such as just route the railway outside of the park. Don't go straight through the park. But the problem is the environmental impact assessment was carried out at such a late stage in the planning process, which had gone on for years, that there was just too much vested interest in having the route that would go through the park. And I forgot to mention with the wildlife barrier, despite how high this is, apparently giraffes still don't like going under these pylons. And so it's a solution, an expensive solution, better than nothing, but still quite incomplete. And so what you see about the environmental impact assessments is that they happen. This is a list of the life cycle phases, the stages of the life cycle, which you can also see in this little nice schematic. And what happens is the strategic planning and the prioritization, when something like the railway, they started thinking about where it would go way back here, but it's quite possible that environmental impact assessments don't happen until well into the process, after all these early stage decisions have been made. And that's really often one of the largest concerns about environmental impact assessments. So in recent years, begin in the 1990s, but really becoming popular in the last decade or two, strategic environmental assessments, SEAs, have become popular to address really that issue. And that is that they have the goal of integrating these concerns in the strategic planning and decision-making stage of the process to prevent and mitigate possible damages and promote sustainable development early, before all these vested interests have been locked in. And the key is that they're not focused on individual projects, but rather plans or policies or programs before the actual individual projects. And in this case, the decision makers are more upstream. They're the planning authorities or the environmental and health or authorities, government decision makers, et cetera. And again, I'm not going to go through details, but in some countries, it's required that any large plan that is screened to have some sort of big environmental or social impact is required to have an SEA. And then there's a scoping assessment. And again, absolutely critically, public participation early in this stage can help lead the way for a much more successful development of these projects downstream. And yeah, so I'm going to give just one example of an SEA, just to give a sense of how this might work. This is in Southeast Asia, in the Mekong Delta. There's been a series of regional processes, but essentially the Mekong River Commission developed an SEA for hydropower throughout the entire region, because from China all the way down into Southeast Asia, there were dams being proposed everywhere, but a dam, say up here in China, the large dam built here could have a big impact down the road, down the stream, downstream literally, if it's not taken into account of what's happening up and down this delta. And so they did a very nice study where they actually came out with a range of strategic options and then actual recommendations that looked at all the potential dams and said, no dams here. Here's an area where you should defer work later. By the time you get to 3, they're proposing which dams to work on immediately, which to consider as alternatives, and also to develop a market for how to develop these dams. And so this is an example of how an strategic environmental assessment can help pave the way. So by the time you get to doing an environmental impact assessment of a particular dam, you've already considered anticipated a lot of the issues, including the cumulative issues of not just that single dam, but how it affects all other processes and regions and communities in that area and beyond. And so again, just to come back to the same, we're talking about doing the strategic environmental assessment at the very early stages of the development process. The benefits are that it improves the efficiency of these policies. It minimizes adverse environmental and social impacts. It saves time because you don't have those big delays like we saw in the Kenya railway. It can identify new opportunities that may not have been identified before. And it doesn't negate the need for individual project environmental impact assessments. Those are still necessary, but they can be done more quickly and the issues have already been identified, and it is just a more, it really streamlines the process. And finally, it can really build public trust. So there's still challenges to the SEAs. They are not as formalized as EIAs are, and there's a perception that the results are a little more wishy-washy because they are so far upstream, and particularly cumulative effects are hard to often understand. And a lot of countries don't have the capacity to do this. So I'm not going to go through all these. This is from UNEP Grid Project, put out this. If anybody is interested, all this material will be online, but it just shows that there's a role for both environmental impact assessments and strategic assessments and what some of the advantages of one or the other are. Just give a moment for you all to skim. Okay, so I've sort of walked through a lot of territory. I want to bring it back to one of the projects that this group has been focusing on, and that's the environmental and social assessment of the Fellbaum Health Center in Kenya, and its association with a community development plan. And I saw that earlier this week, there was a really nice field assessment that brought up a lot of potential opportunities and issues, potential opportunities like solar power panels that can help not only provide clean energy, but also a stability that doesn't require as much reliance on local and national grids, and other issues related to all sorts of different, not only the health facility, but the impact of the health facility on the surrounding community. What I wanted to point out was how if the project, the focus of the project is the health facility, but it's really the health facility within the community development, with hoping for sustainable development of the entire community, not just one building. And this is really an important opportunity to do some early stage cumulative plan that can look at what the various impacts of this health center may be and what are the opportunities, but also issues that need to be mitigated early on before the project is too far underway and it becomes much harder to mitigate the issues. And one thing that just immediately came to mind as I went through the materials was there is plans to improve the transportation access to the clinic, which obviously is going to be very important. But right now there's already an issue with illegal gold mining. And what immediately jumped to my mind is, will this improved transport actually create more access for gold mining and increase the problems that are already occurring there, rather than addressing them directly as part of the larger development plan? And if it does increase the gold mining, that's going to actually increase the health concerns, and therefore you're going to need the health facility even more due to all of the mercury and other pollutant hazards. And just to remind you of what happens when gold mining, now I'm not saying this is going to happen in that area. I don't think we're anywhere close to this, but right now in areas of the Amazon in Brazil, Peru, Colombia, in Ghana, in areas of Southeast Asia, gold mining is becoming a devastating problem. And so it's really important, as one is developing this area, and you know that this is one of the issues, is to really try and address it early on in the development process. So I'm not going to provide any answers. I'm just going to throw out some ideas of where one might go. I think an environmental and social assessment would be a great next step. The scope would probably include energy for the health facility, but also the surrounding community, water for the health facility and also the surrounding community, transportation. That's where both water and transportation is where the gold mining is probably going to come into play, and the cumulative impacts of changing transportation structures and settlements. And it's important in this assessment to look at not just the direct, but the indirect or cumulative impacts that this, all these different infrastructure. And I know in some of the earlier collaboratives, the discussions that you all have had, you've talked quite a bit about systems planning. And really, a lot of this comes back to thinking about whole systems and how they work together, rather than just each individual item separately. So how can one carry this out? One is there are consultants, there are international multilateral agencies that can probably provide either advice. I know there are folks from UNOPS already doing a lot of help with all the project planning and may be able to help in this. There's also the ability to train up through either through the organization working on it or through some of the universities perhaps, or other organizations build up the capacity to do this. There's also the, and these are not either or, these are likely a combination of these options. The third is what I'm going to now wrap back to where I started, and that is thinking about developing a regional or global community of practice and shared learning through the ECHO model, like peace engineering ECHO model. And this is also something that the SI-CoL, the Sustainable Infrastructure Community of Learners, is also looking to develop, and perhaps bringing these two communities together to see what could be done. The idea would be to not just focus on this health center, but to identify a series of other projects with similar type of environmental and social assessment issues and processes, and do a series of similar collaboratives where they would share what the issues are, lessons learned amongst different groups trying to embark on this process, but also through SI-CoL, we can bring in some of the expert individuals and organizations that are working specifically on this topic, depending on whether it's a water project or transportation or something at a health center systems level, where they would be able to provide input on and provide expertise. So it would go in the direction between different projects in maybe different countries or different regions, but also providing the expertise to help in the process. And we are trying to start up. This is just, we're going to be using that same life cycle chart and begin to use these different phases to have groups be able to present on this. We're also going to be doing a series of case studies, seminars, which I would be happy, anyone interested, I will include you on our mailing list. We're starting those up actually next month. I think looking at the first case study will be from Singapore, where they're doing green buildings. And I think it should be really exciting. And then finally, this is a crazy picture, but just to give a sense, SI-CoL has all these experts. And what I am suggesting or envisioning, that one possible group might be linking with peace engineers and projects like this Kenya project, where we bring experts on, say, environmental assessments or other topics to do some of these collaborative project-based learning. And my final thought, as I said, if you take one message from my talk today, it's that upstream planning, thinking about these things early in the process, whether you're working on a single project, a community project, or a national level infrastructure plan, the earlier you address these, the easier and greater success you'll have down the road. And I have a couple of resources that might be helpful, including that project cycle chart is actually from this German GIZ website, Sustainable Infrastructure Tools, which will identify existing tools for different stages of the process. UNEP has put out a recent document just last month on best practices and case studies, which our webinar series is going to be drawing from these. Also, some more detailed information on environmental assessments. And if you would like to get on our mailing list for webinars or information, this is right here is my email address. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. You're on the spot with your presentation. This is something that we all need to be aware, and we need to really consider. Great presentation. We need to look at the upstream, like you said. Even when we lecture, right? When we teach, we got to think about what's going to be that impact that we tend to drop. I'm going to open up now for Q&A. Donna, can you help me with the questions? There's several questions on the chat. I know Mita has some questions, Ilman, and I will pass the microphone. Donna, if you can help me with the Q&A.
Our first question is from George Rowe, and he says, who typically funds and owns results for an SEA?
I think they're often done at the national level, or at the regional level. So obviously an SEA at the national level is not what I had in mind for the Kenya project, because typically it's covering maybe an entire sector. For example, Ghana is looking at expanding bauxite mining, and they're looking at the example that I showed in Guinea, and they actually have a law that requires sectors that are going to have a big impact on the environment to do an SEA, although they have not yet done an SEA for bauxite mining. So that would be an example. The government would do that. Multilateral development banks have been very active, especially the Inter-American Development Bank, which I mentioned, in coming in and helping a lot of countries with these, because they don't always have the capacity to do it. Other organizations as well, but it's often at that scale. I mentioned also this group, this government agency in the Netherlands called the Netherlands Commission on Environmental Assessments. Actually, it's a lot of expertise in SEAs, and they've done some great work. And if you go see their website, I think I put it on my resources, you can see they will come in and help a country, a region. They're not necessarily doing the whole national level. They'll do it a little at a smaller level. So it's a range, but they're often at a pretty high level.
Thank you. The next question is from Hillman Mitchell, and it's a long question. So Hillman, I'll ask you to ask it.
Okay. So Liz, good to see you this morning. Thank you so much for the presentation. It's a great presentation. And I think you actually touched on this after I typed the question, so it's probably a little bit redundant. But I'm looking for a model that we can use on individual projects like the Fellbaum Medical Clinic, and, if you will, network those together with other small projects so that there's a common methodology that's used for the strategic environmental and social assessments. And basically just make sure that we're looking at the cumulative effect, not just of a project, but of projects across the region, which many times the impacts span beyond jurisdictional authorities. So it's not something that I think you can just approach it from the county or the provincial governmental authorities. But I think if we can start to identify some methods that can be used so that these interconnect and we see the cumulative effect of small projects, but don't make it so heavy that it takes tremendous amount of funding and time to perform.
I agree completely, and my reference to systems level planning, I think, is exactly the sort of thing you're talking about. And I think that there's just an increasing understanding that linked with this upstream planning, the two really go hand in hand, are incredibly important, and they're easy to ignore because everyone wants to get on with things. But the savings, whether money, time, the outcome, are just so clearly beneficial that there is a movement toward it. As far as where to go, I would say one, there are a bunch of different groups working on this, and I think I might have in the resources put one in. I will try and add some, but in addition to the Netherlands group, UNOPS has a group that has been very focused on this systems level planning, and they have a whole series of tools that that they make available. And I will make sure that these documents are in the the resources section. I think one of the issues also, which I said in the beginning and that our group is trying to deal with, is it's not that there aren't tools out there, it's there just so many, and how do you know what to use? And there really aren't best practices. This document I put that UNEP just came up with is best practices. We're getting there. I know there's a big effort, for example, on the finance side to try and come up with a rating standard that brings together all the different rating standards that have come up on sustainable infrastructure so that a bank or a government that has a mandate to only be financing sustainable infrastructure actually has a way of knowing what that is. Or like a PPP unit in a government that is doing public-private partnerships, how do they know? Well, there's a program with in the World Bank under the Global Infrastructure Foundation, GIB, that is coming up with something called Fast Infra and is coming out this year trying to come up with one standard at that level. So there are people working on this. I'll provide a few suggestions, but also that's part of what our group is trying to do, is do some of this standardization and harmonization.
Excellent. And one other question. Do these processes for the SEAs, do they include, processes and tools that address conflict mitigation and resolution?
As I noted, there isn't a one-size-fits-all SEA process in the same way there is for EIAs. I mean, there isn't one for EIAs, but there's a fair amount of agreement on what one wants out of an environmental impact assessment. SEAs are kind of all over the board. And so I could probably point you to some people who've thought about that with conflict. I'm not really sure the answer, but I would be surprised if there aren't some out there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. The next question is from Mira Olson from Drexel. Mira, you want to ask your question?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for your talk and presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think this is a great model. So looking at the indirect impacts, or the cascading, reverberating, whatever you want to call them, to look at what we already do for environmental assessments and add in the social. So the dam to the water quality to what that does to social cohesion and livelihoods. So I love that. I'm wondering if you have any examples where, instead of just looking at the upstream to downstream impacts, where you end up with a whole bunch of what ifs, if you have any that already look at like existing downstream, like the communities that already have priorities and development plans, if you haven't seen any examples where they've actually looked at impacts on those existing priorities and development plans.
So interesting idea. When you say looked at the impact of what on that, an SEA or a project or?
Project, multiple projects, anything that you're normally looking at the downstream impacts of.
Interesting question. I'll have to go back and look. I can't think of an example of that directly, but that sounds like a great project for you to, go work on. That's an interesting idea, turning it the other way around. Probably, I don't know the full literature, but nothing jumps to mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Another question we have is from Robert Crease. Robert, would you ask your question, please?
I was wondering if any teaching or use of this information by the professional associations such as Project Management Association or the cost engineers, they have agendas and things to consider. Have any of their literature brought anything in about the environmental and social aspects?
I think a lot of these industries have, industry associations have like a group of those individuals that are especially concerned right now. I know there is a group, what is the name of it, called, it comes out of the American Civil Engineering, the Association of American Civil Engineers, and the international group out of the UK, the ICE. I'm not sure what the UK group is, and they have, I can't remember the name of the group, but it is being run by something called Resilience Shift, which I don't remember the name, but it's a very large group of engineers, civil engineers, who have a commitment towards bringing resilience, which is closely linked to a lot of these topics, into the engineering process. And they just got together and have just put some items out, and I just can't remember the name of the group, but I'd be happy to look that up and share that if it would be of interest. So that would be an example, but I think all these big groups have smaller subgroups focused on this because this is a very big and important topic.
Okay, thank you. Enjoyed the presentation. And what I was wondering is, there is in other programs like business, industrial engineering, they all teach courses on project management. But I doubt that they really include these concepts.
And that is why it needs to be incorporated into engineering curricula.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Agree completely.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's one more, we'll have to tie up very soon now, but there's a very interesting question from Professor Benjamin Imasoji. Could you please ask your question?
Oh, thank you very much. My concern is on professional ethics of miners or mining companies and multinationals that are involved in exploration in Africa. They don't seem to care about the lives and livelihood and the environment. I saw a lot of pictures that was shown by Professor Losos, and they are really very devastating. And I can see that these multinationals, they really don't care, and they cannot be held accountable. This is very bad. We know that most of these minerals are being mined here in Africa, and probably they don't add any value to it. But you can see from the pictures of devastation of the environment, and how does this factor into this impact assessment? Because these people, this is their land, this is where they live. And some of these things, because when you come to mercury pollution, you come to cyanide pollution, it's really very devastating. We want to hear more of this. How do we address this in the line of peace engineering? It's really a very bad situation we have on our hands. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the lecture. It was quite interesting. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more, and that's probably a whole nother session just on that. Couple of comments. There are actually two different levels of mining that are of concern. One, some of the pictures of the gold mining, those are actually small scale miners, often individuals that are just individuals getting tiny amounts of gold and providing it to middlemen that provide it to these larger dealers, et cetera. And those aren't the large corporations. Those are the small scale. And a lot of it has to do with increasing prices of metal. On the other hand, you also have these huge companies. And we actually just this week, a colleague and I put out a case study, a working brief on bauxite mining in Ghana. And in this case, the issue, I was just the editor, he was the author. I'm happy to send it to you, but one of the problems is we were looking particularly at Chinese finance mining projects where China has created these what are called resource infrastructure agreements, where they promise to pay back infrastructure loans to China with the proceeds from developing the natural resources, and in this case, bauxite. And what happens is, even though Ghana has a requirement to do a strategic environmental assessment, that requirement doesn't pertain to these resource agreements. They're done before anything else. Nobody looks at the impact of these resource agreements. They're just looking at the money that they're getting from China for infrastructure. And so they get locked into these agreements that require them to keep developing, even if it's shown that they're not going to be able to develop the resource without some very severe impacts on communities, environment, et cetera. And I will make that new study available in some of our suggestions, but it is a big issue and it really has to be dealt with at the governmental levels, a lot of these issues, because if you wait until doing an environmental impact assessment, these companies are way too powerful to actually do any serious change to their project by the time they're handed a list of all the, I mean, they'll tweak something, but it has to be dealt with at an earlier stage if you're going to have any real structural impacts. So, but I know I've gone over, and happy to talk with anyone. My email's out there, and I know there are other questions. I'll see if I can maybe get a list of those questions. My email address is elosos, Losos @duke.edu if anybody wants to get in touch to follow up.
So Elizabeth, I know you have a hard cutoff at 9:10. Can you take one or two more questions?
I can take one or two more questions, and then I really have a hard cutoff.
Okay, so Billy Givetti has a question. Can you ask your question, Billy?
Thank you, Liz. I learned something today about the EIS. Today you mentioned the gold mining as one of the potential conflict areas, but the one we did also face a direct conflict was when we tried to expand the road to allow a vehicle or a truck to pass. You taught us something about house to house, involvement of the people. And I think it is something from the EIA, the way they conduct the EIS in our country, I've not seen that happen much per se. Most times they'll call a meeting in the community or select people. So that is something I think in a much more detail later on, maybe you can expose to our group how to conduct that. But I also did like the slide where you showed students in class learning about this type of issues. I think those are very wonderful ways to go about it. So maybe just one more comment of how you think an effective way of going house to house, recruiting or, yes.
different communities will be different. What's the most successful way? But having town meetings is probably good. You do want to make it so that all the stakeholders feel that they are allowed to participate. Sometimes you hear of cases where groups are excluded or they're not given the invitation. So you want it to be as open and participatory and transparent as possible, but it will vary from local situation to local situation. What is the best way of getting that input?
Thank you. If Micah Armenta is still on the line, you can ask your question.
I don't see her, Donna.
Okay.
Greg has a hand up too. Greg Wilson.
Well, thank you so much for this. Yeah, I'm just really interested in any follow-up around how. So I'm involved in a library project that it helps address this with peace engineering algorithms and other aspects of the early educational opportunities.
I'm sorry, algorithms.
You know, just
on,
if it's how on the approach to educating people in the community itself so they can participate earlier in the assessment project and public opinion. You know, the other aspect to me is data transparency. I've worked in the public data transparency. So I'm just wondering if you've seen some good models that really involve, you know, that the systematizing it a little better to ensure that people can have access to information and find it, you know, find a sooner source of information so they can weigh in on these topics and just integrate it more with the standard approach.
Okay, I'll try and make some available in those resources. I think you also might want to look at that UNOPS in particular. But I'll try and make that available in the resources and get it to Donna, who can post it on with the link or something.
Thank you so much. Very helpful.
Thank you, everybody, for your participation. I know some people had to leave early. I want to thank again Liz. There was an awesome presentation. There's so much to do. And again, thank you, everybody. We will keep in touch. We'll contact you for our next collaborative. Thank you, Donna, for organizing this. And thank you, please, everybody stay safe.